In part 1, I described the AI Z-depth user interface in detail. I also showed how adjusting the various parameters when the effect was used as a compositor, text could be made to appear in an image event as if the event was three-dimensional. In this part, I want to demonstrate how the same effect can be used with a video event where the foreground subject is moving. I also want to show how text can be made to appear to move from behind the foreground object, through it, to the front of it. I'll demonstrate this using the titles and text media generator that's native to Vegas Pro. If you're fortunate enough to own the Boris FX Title Studio plugin, I'll show how to use this also. When the effect is used with an image, as shown in part 1, the procedure is fairly simple. It's not so simple when the text event is composited with a video event, where the foreground subject is moving. The various parameters of the tool may have to be animated using keyframes to take into account the movement of the subject. I won't be describing keyframing in detail in this tutorial. I'll assume that you are familiar with the principles. Obviously, the greater the complexity of movement will involve more complex keyframing than simple movement. The video I have on the timeline is, as you can see, a close-up of a parrot. I'll play the video so you can see the amount of movement. I intend to place a text string behind the parrot's head and animate the parameters, if necessary, to make sure that the masking remains good throughout the video. As in part 1, I'll apply the tool as a compositor on the track containing the text event. Refer to part 1 for details. As was shown in part 1, by default the text is superimposed onto the foreground object. I'll uncheck the Invert checkbox. The text is now behind the parrot's head. Now watch what happens when I play the timeline. The tool tries to compensate for the movement, but it fails in a lot of places. The first thing to do is scrub the timeline to find where the maximum mask error occurs. This looks to be the worst. Now to check the threshold depth display. You can see the parts of the head that the tool considers to be not in the foreground. I could try the nearest and furthest sliders, but in this case that won't fix it. If you watch part 1, you may remember that I didn't use the depth in or depth out sliders. I didn't need to. With this kind of depth map, the kind that changes dynamically, these parameters need adjusting. Using the depth map values in the threshold depth visualization to adjust these parameters, which is the official recommended method, is ineffective and frustrating. I found that the best way of doing this is to adjust these sliders until the required result is obtained, but not more. I'll start by making the depth in value 0. Now I'll adjust the depth out slider until the map shows the head fully in the foreground. Now to check the text. So that's OK for that frame. I'll check the rest. That's done a pretty good job without having to keyframe. I can try to improve the mask boundary with the auto feather checkbox. Whether this is an improvement is a matter of opinion. You can create quite complex animations by keyframing the Z depth parameters. I challenged myself to create one where a text string appears to move through two separate objects while increasing in size. However, it took me quite some time to achieve this, so I won't be describing this procedure. I'll describe something less complex. Again, I'm using a still image here, but with one foreground object instead of two. Like the video, I'll be demonstrating how text can be made to appear as if it's moving through a solid object. On the timeline, I have a titles and text event on track 1 and an image with one object, the monolith, on track 2. The idea is to make the text start from behind the object, move through it, and come to a stop. As before, I'll apply the Z depth effect as a composite. I'll start with animating the text. I'm going to temporarily disable the Z depth until I've finished animating the text. I've previously set up the font attributes to suit me. You can obviously set these up to suit yourself. At the start, the text will appear to be in the distance to the left of the object, partly hidden. By the way, this won't be all that realistic because the text can't be represented as a three-dimensional object. Later on, when I demonstrate this using text generated by Boris FX Title Studio, I'll be able to create true three-dimensional text. Before making any adjustment to the location, I'll make sure that the playhead is at the beginning. Because I want the text to move and increase size while moving, I need to animate both the location and scale parameters. Now to move the text to a suitable start position. I need to decide where I want the text to stop. I'll set the playhead at 4 seconds. At this point, I'll move the text to a suitable finish point. To create the illusion of depth, the text needs to be bigger at this point. I'll increase the scale to do this. Now for the AI Z-depth animation. Something to be aware of when animating the Z-depth parameters. If you're proficient at keyframing, you may be tempted to change the interpolation mode of various keyframes. I have to warn you, don't. If you do, there are certain conditions that will cause Vegas to crash, and if you don't save regularly, you'll lose all your work. This bug has been reported and should be fixed in due course. In the meantime, keep away from the interpolation modes. I'll be animating the nearest parameter, so with the playhead at the start, I'll activate the animation icon. I want the text to start exiting the object at the 2-second mark, so I'll move the playhead to there. I'll add a keyframe there. I want the text to gradually appear from the rock rather than just suddenly appearing. To do this, the nearest value must be made to decrease over time from when the text starts to emerge. This can be a bit of a trial and error, but a good rule of thumb is to have the nearest value change from 1 to 0 between the text emerging and stopping. So a second keyframe must be added where the text is due to stop. From the text animation, this will be at 4 seconds. At this point, I want the nearest value to be 0. This section is aimed at those of you who are fortunate enough to have the Boris FX Title Studio plugin. The method when using Title Studio instead of titles and text is basically the same. There are a couple of differences though. Titles and text is a media event, so it's just a case of adding it to the timeline. Title Studio is an effect, so it has to be applied to a media event. An easy way of doing this is to apply the Title Studio effect to an empty event. The other difference is that text created in Title Studio can be rotated in three-dimensional space. More on this later. With the rock image on track 2, I'll create an empty event on track 1. If you don't know how to do this, create a timeline selection on track 1 equal to the length of the image event. You can do this easily by double-clicking on the image event. Right-click on the track 1 selection area and select Insert Empty Event from the context menu. Now apply the Title Studio effects to the empty event. Make the necessary changes to the text string in the main Title Studio UI and click Apply. I've already done this and created a preset. Now to create the text animation. I'll use the Transformations option for this, so I'll click on the Transformations arrow. Click the Use Transformations checkbox if it's unchecked. I can now position the text with the on-screen crosshairs icon. This icon highlights in blue when you cursor over it. Note that for precise control of the crosshairs, hold down the Control key while moving it. For even more precise control, open up the Position panel, click inside it, then hold the Control key down while using the keyboard arrow keys to move the text. I want the text to appear as if it's coming forward, finishing in the middle of the rock. To do this, I need to make sure that the cursor is at the beginning, then enable keyframing for the X-Y position parameter by clicking the clock icon at its side. Now I need to determine when I want the text to stop coming forward. The event is 5 seconds long, so I'll make it stop at 4 seconds. Now I'll move the text to where I want it to stop. This will create a keyframe. Now I need to make it increase in size while it's moving. I'll animate the master scale to do this. Remember, make sure that the playhead is at the beginning before activating the master scale animation icon. Now I'll advance to the next keyframe and increase the scale. Now, to make it more realistic, I'm going to rotate the text slightly in the Y direction. Don't overdo this, about -30 should do. Because I want it to become face on after it emerges from the rock, I need to animate it. I want to rotate it back near the end, so I'll set the cursor to about 3 seconds. At this point, I still want the text to be rotated, so I'll add a keyframe. A point to note, when you use the Add Keyframe plus icon for a particular parameter, make sure that parameter in the keyframe timeline header is highlighted. Where the text stops, I want it to be face on, so I'll move the playhead to the 4-second mark. At this point, I'll set the Rotate Y parameter to 0. Okay, so that looks good. I'll now close the UI. And now for the Z depth effect. I'll apply it to track 1 as before. The method here is exactly as shown with the titles and text method, so I won't go into much detail. Again, I'll be animating the nearest parameter. Now I'll put the playhead at a position where I want the text to start to emerge from the front of the rock. As with the titles and text method, I'll set it at 2 seconds and add a keyframe. I'll now go to the 4-second mark and set the nearest parameter to 0. Not quite what I wanted. The text emerges at the left side of the rock. I really want it to emerge from the middle. Remember, I did say it was a bit of trial and error. To try and achieve this, I'm going to move the first keyframe to the 3-second mark. That should delay the emergence so it appears more in the middle. That's a bit better. I could move the keyframe nearer to the 4-second keyframe to make the text emerge later, but that would make the keyframe slope steeper. Making the slope steeper causes the text to emerge quicker, minimizing the realistic effect. That's how to animate the AIZ depth effect when used as a compositor. In part 3, I'll describe the tool when applied as an effect to a media event. Thanks for watching, and if you haven't already done so, please subscribe to my channel. Until next time, bye for now.